marka anaga maxaan mar sanadkan bar baan daaqi jirnay sanadkii dambana dhinac baan daaqayna markii roob joog iyo markii barbaxta.
There's so many things that comes to affect the women's conflicts, like especially rapings when they go for firewood.
Remaining the yarang tinto on Nagaporona, Mertona Brinia Gapora, Catamatonia Moita, Reming Barnia Valotorim.
The Horn of Africa contains the largest grouping of pastoralists in the world. This number involves more than 20 million pastoralists currently living a lifestyle that is centered on the search for increasingly scarce pasture and water. Pastoralists occupy predominantly the arid and semi-arid areas which border Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia and Somalia. The region is arid and semi-arid and is prone to cyclical droughts. Pastoralists' livelihoods necessitate semi or wholly nomadic livestock grazing. The semi-arid and arid areas in the Horn make up 70% of the total land area, which provides an average of 20 to 30% of the GDP. Pastoralists traditionally move from one area to another in search of pasture and water for their livestock. They move with their livestock in response to drought, so every time there is climatic stress, which manifests itself in failure of the rains, pastoralists traditionally migrate. With the increasing frequency and severity of the drought due to climate change, pastoralists' land can no longer sustain them and people are being forced to migrate internally and across borders. More frequent and protracted drought, with implications for depleted livestock, limited pasture, water and food insecurity, is eroding pastoralists' traditional livelihood and is currently the most significant weather-related hazard contributing to conflict and mass displacement in the Horn of Africa. Since October 2008, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the International Organization for Migration, the Institute for Security Studies, and the United Nations Environment Programme have been jointly consulting and visiting pastoralist communities in the border areas of the Horn and East Africa to get their perspective on durable solutions to their insecurity and livelihood challenges. These consultations have included identifying pastoralists' perspectives on the best strategies for building their resilience to drought and reducing conflict emanating from their mobility to access water and pasture. The Security in Mobility Interagency Assessment Team visited approximately 60 pastoralist community leaders representing over 100,000 pastoralists in the Karamoja cluster, Maasai cluster, and Mandera Somali cluster. The interagency team traveled approximately 10,000 kilometers across the region, where most of the roads were not easily accessible by car. The Security in Mobility assessments involved consultations spanning 18 months from January 2009 to July 2010 and covering the border areas of Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Sudan, and Ethiopia.
The mandate of OCHA is to alleviate human suffering during times of disaster and conflict. For a long time, climate change was regarded as an environmental phenomenon. And so the scientists and researchers and the whole discussion around our engagement around climate change was very much focused on the impact on the environment and global warming and other things like that. Particularly in this region that we started to feel the consequences of climate change and some of the environmental destruction was starting to have human consequences. And that's why we've started in OCHA over the last 2 to 3 years really pumping up the dialogue in terms of the humanitarian impact of climate change.
Dating edek yang barin tong apa kedewa. Tada urobo edek yang ulong barin tadi urumuri tong apa kuru. Nah ya turu puninginya. Halo tor banginya tong apa? Tada unu dengan barin lu jika nak kerja kanu kekari tari edeki kekari tari edeki. Bebene bunyi angolol rami ceburi. Kalle ya lu modin kaina.
Yongogi amure nigi jegi dalra lungani nigi jegi aya ganda ala ngorage ni silli gabengi yogishi engi yogishi meganda rengi yogishi amere engi yogishi yongogi
xilliyadii baa is bedelay sida aad iyaga cimilada ay leeyihiin xilliyadii baa iska kaaya bedelay oo waqtigii gul la heli jiro kale in uu bil ama laba dib ay u dhacdo
marka anaga maxaan ahayn mar sanadkan ber baan daaqi jirnay sanadkii dambana dhinac baan daaqayna markii roob joog iyo markii barbaxta sidaa noqda miskiin noqda guriga lagu soo xarooday maxaa noogu darnaa inaan waynay biyo magaalada saa u degan 7 meel ay biyaheeda yihiin dameer lagu doon
amagin nagraruga mere nikinyoge amiki ara sogonini nimiki ara weiri nigilisha yengara niriru yangasi aju.
In the case of security and mobility, because of our area of focus and our mandate focusing on the environment, we obviously focus on very key ecosystems, looking at rivers, mountains, forests, and other important ecosystems, even drylands, of which people are very dependent on. And we realized over time that with drought and famine, there's obviously mobility, which in this case is movement. And people move because of scarcity of resources within these ecosystems. So we thought this was a very important area that UNEP had to be involved in.
The harsh and dramatic climatic changes in the region has been the driving force to seasonal migration by the pastoralist communities in search of pasture and water. An adaptive trend that has adversely increased the challenge of insecurity posed by mixed migration in the region. Unlike certain categories of migrants, such as refugees and IDPs, pastoralist communities are the only group of people whose migration has never been formally recognized or protected. Freedom and flexibility of movement within national borders and beyond is essential to the viability of mobile pastoralism, even more so in the face of climate change. However, much evidence points to mobility being restricted on various grounds, increasing pastoralists' inability to minimize risks and cope with climatic and other shocks.
During the time I was a young boy here, we hardly moved to Uganda because there was water along this riverbed and there were frequent rains and therefore there were pastures available within Turkana, where the logical changes here started mid-1970s. And that's the time when Turkana people started to move to the Ugandan escarpment because there was no grass here.
We all understand that when you say pastoralism, there is movement implied therein. And we all understand that pastoralists, especially in this region and across the world, have been moving from time immemorial in search of pasture, in search of water. IOM's concern is what type of protection, what type of migration management is in place to support and assist the safe and orderly movement of pastoralists across borders and also within country. And that is the main gap that IOM saw in what was happening with the climate change, adaptation processes, issues of livelihoods, issues of security. IOM saw a gap in the protection of pastoralists.
Pastoral production systems often face difficulties with state borders as they move in search of pasture and water for livestock, which were historically divided without consideration of pastoralist needs and access. While there is existence of the joint border commissions, what is clear is that there are no provisions for a normative regional framework or mechanisms to address migratory patterns and traditional corridors.
Aja kerja mele mario. Anika cadai.
The Institute for Security Studies is in partnership with the Eastern Africa Police Chiefs Cooperation Organization on a project that is supporting governments to prevent, combat and eradicate cattle rustling in Eastern Africa. And in our interventions we have found that there is a close relationship between the